Okay, so we're going to be looking today at something that is part of the field of conversation analysis in applied linguistics. I think that it's quite an important area, and it's also one that people are generally unaware of. If you're very aware of it, then congratulations, you're in what I would call the minority. So let's have a look. There we go. So we're going to be looking at two genres of what conversation analysts call talk-in interaction. And the reason that they call it talk-in interaction is because basically they're not very interested in monologues or speeches. These forms of speaking are not terribly interesting because they don't have a great dynamic. All that happens is one person speaks and other people listen and receive what is said. It's much more interesting for conversation analysts to look at interactions between people. And it might be between groups of people, but usually we find that there are only two people involved at any particular moment. One person speaking and one person receiving what is being said and who will then respond. So the reason that I got really interested in this was because I've spent a lot of time teaching writing. And if you're like me and you're passionate about writing, you know all about the different genres of writing. So you know that essays have particular conventions that you have to follow. Certainly, if you're preparing people for any of the Cambridge exams, you need to know what sort of conventions apply to the essay. It is, after all, the compulsory question in the writing paper. B2 first, C1 advanced, and C2 proficiency levels. So you need to know what the genre means for essays, but you also need to know that they're not the same as articles. If you write an article like an essay, you're not going to do so well, especially if you then go further and you come down to reports or proposals and you say, it's still the same genre. No, these are different genres. They have different conventions. Stories and reviews also have different conventions. The audience is different, the language you use is different, everything like that is different. So I've spent a lot of time recently, or over the last, I'd say 5 or 6 years, I suppose, really investing a lot of time and effort in learning about these different genres to help my students talk. But it's only recently, not to help them talk, of course, to help my students write. It's only recently that I've started thinking about speaking and speech patterns and what the conversation analysts out there are doing. And that's what got me interested in this area. Because if there are so many different genres of writing and you have to know the rules of the writing to do the writing, what if the different genres of talk and interaction or speaking more broadly, what if these different genres are different, have different conventions? Our students need to know about that. They need to know about it when they see somebody talking, or when they watch YouTube and see people talking, and also when they come to talk themselves. So that's going to be the focus of our session here. So looking at the different genres of talk and interaction, there are just lots and lots of different genres, and within these different genres we also have subgenres. So even in what we're going to be looking at first, the conversation between people generally, this is what they call ordinary conversation. Even within this genre, you find subgenres depending on the social position of the interactors. You have a difference depending on age as well. So first, I'd like you to have a think by yourselves, and you can post away with your comments, put them in here so other people can see if you like. But when we think of ordinary conversation, like the two people here in the picture, when we think about the sort of talk that they're having, what do you think the conventions are? Do you think, for example, there will be interruptions? Or do you think that one person will talk and then stop, and then the other person will continue talking and then stop, and so on and so on? Do you think that there will be references to other people's conversations or to events outside of whatever topic there is that's under discussion? So I'll give you a few seconds to think about that before I turn to the next slide. Hopefully everyone understands what we mean by ordinary conversation there. It's not ordinary because it's boring. This is ordinary because there is it's not in necessarily a formal situation. So let's have a look then. So here are some of the areas that I thought would be worth looking at when we talk about ordinary conversation. And the first one would be the interaction pattern. So what is meant by an interaction pattern? In a lot of talking, people will listen to the person speaking to them, and they will interrupt if necessary. We'll come to interruptions in a moment. But basically, you will have the first person will speak, so they initiate. The second person will respond as and when is necessary. And we might find that there is feedback from the first person. So they'll respond to the response, essentially. We've got a question here. First one, fantastic. Must we differentiate between ordinary conversations which are bound with colloquialisms and broadcast interviews? It's not really the language that we're looking at here. You will find broadcast interviews, when we get onto that are bound with colloquialisms. You will get ordinary conversation that doesn't. A lot of it depends. The two people in the picture are probably from the same cultural background, as far as we can guess. So they will have a shared vocabulary of these sort of colloquial expressions. So when one uses one, the other person will understand them. When I talk in an ordinary conversation with a lot of my friends, if they're from Poland, for example, I try to keep my colloquial language to a minimum because I want to enhance communication. And if you go with the English as a lingua franca, then you will, I think it was it Jeffers? Who was it that came up with this idea of English as lingua franca and restricting the body of the language so that it was easier to communicate in it? Yeah, so if you think about that, then we would reduce the number of colloquial expressions. So anyway, looking at in more detail at some of these conventions, the next thing I've listed here is turn taking and marking turn taking. Now, when you're having a polite conversation, it's very important that you have an understanding with the person that you're talking with as to when it's your turn to talk and when it's not, essentially. For example, in English, I think that the response part of an interaction is often implied, but that's maybe in Britain, maybe in America, but it's not universal. And I remember once I made a Swedish friend of mine extremely unhappy because she would ask me a question about something and I would answer, and then I'd look at her and kind of raise my eyebrows. And that was my way of saying, I've finished my turn. Now you answer that same question. Tell me what you wanted to say. I didn't want to be so explicit as to say, that is the end of my summary answer. Can you tell me your answer to your question? We don't tend to do it that way. So in some cultures, turn taking is marked in a different way to in others. But when you think about conversations between speakers, you often find that when one person wants to finish their turn, maybe they lean back. Finished. As they're speaking, they lean back, their voice goes quiet, and they open a kind of space for their partner to then come in with their turn. And that brings us on to the idea of interruptions. And you do find that interruptions in ordinary conversation are possible, certainly, and are probably going to be prolific depending on who's speaking and what the topic is. But there is a kind of cultural aspect here, and there's certainly an aspect of social position. For example, I remember back on my CELTA when I was doing my initial teacher training, I went to the pub with the CELTA tutor, along with some of the other people in my tutor group. And we were sitting there having a drink, talking to the tutor. And I was just struck for a moment. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it much, but I was really struck by the fact that nobody was interrupting him. We would sit there listening to him talk in almost exactly the same way that we would if we were back in the school taking input or taking feedback from his lesson observations. And then we would be looking for the end of his turn before we spoke. He left before the rest of us. He went back to his wife and his little child, and we stayed in the pub for a bit longer, continued talking, and suddenly interruptions left, right, and centre. So interruptions are really cultural. They are social as well. When you see a difference in position between people, you find that the number of interruptions is often reduced. So the next thing then is referential language. And when you're having a conversation with somebody, you will find that you refer to what other people have said. You might refer back to previous parts of the same kind of conversation. Well, to give you an example, so at my school, at International House, we teach in 90-minute blocks. And then before and after each 90-minute block, we have a 15-minute break. And in theory, that's the time when you would tidy up, move to the next classroom, and get set up. But people often go back to the staff room to restock on things in between. So you might start a conversation with somebody, asking them, you know, what are your plans for the weekend, something like that. You're interrupted by the lesson. 90 minutes later, you come back in and say, yeah, like I was saying before, I'm thinking of going to see a football match on Saturday. Are you interested in coming? So that's referential language. That's pointing back. But the other kind of referential language that we get a lot of with ordinary conversation is when, like, a friend comes up to you and says, oh, Chris, I wanted to tell you about, and they tell you about the thing. Maybe they've been to I don't know, they've been to an art exhibition, or something happened outside, or something crazy happened in their lesson. So that's the reason for the conversation to start. And the start of the conversation is, oh, I wanted to tell you about this thing. So remember, as we're going through these are the conventions of ordinary conversation. We're going to be looking at the differences between them very soon, between this genre and other genres, such as the broadcast interview. Right, the next one, I like this. I didn't know what it was only a year or two ago, because it's an unusual word. If you know what phatic language is, congratulations, that's wonderful. Phatic language is a very English thing, I would say, very British. It's a little bit like the whole talking about the weather sort of thing. And it's talk for the sake of talk. It's social greasing the wheels. It's the way that you can start talking to some people. You can't go up to somebody necessarily that you don't know and say, later today I'm going to go shopping. It would be weird to do that. So what we do instead is we say, oh, warm today, isn't it? The other person says, yes, yeah, glad I brought my jacket. You go, yes, yeah, I hear that it will be a bit cooler later though, so yeah, it's a good job you had a jacket instead of nothing. You go, yeah, oh, well, it's not quite coat weather, is it? And it goes on like this, and then maybe at some stage, that's the end of the conversation. It is entirely phatic, or the person that wanted to say, oh, I'm going to go shopping later, they get to say it, but they need to get through the phatic language first. They need to grease the wheels. Okay, and that brings us to repair. Now, I read a book, believe it or not, a little while ago, that talked about the discoveries that the early conversation analysts had. And they had these discoveries when they started to transcribe the Nixon Watergate scandal tapes. So they were going through, and this is the president of the USA, and they were going through transcribing what he said. And they were stunned by what they found, because when they were listening to the recordings, everything just sounded normal. But when they wrote everything down and they looked again at what was written on the page, they suddenly went, you know, this isn't even a sentence. What's going on here? These are not sentences. It's all broken. It's they start talking, then they stop, then they go back. It's odd, very odd. But that's what we call repair. So repair is partly error correction, especially with people for whom English is not necessarily a mother tongue. But more often we find that repair is when somebody starts talking and then they realize that where they're going, where that sentence is taking them, is not where they want it to be. So they kind of stop and then they go back a bit, maybe a clause, maybe only half a clause, and then they say what they wanted to say. So it's a bit like saying, for example, so I was walking down the street the other day, so when I was walking down the street, I saw this guy, so I saw a guy when I was walking down the street. You could have a couple of attempts to start the sentence depending on how much forethought you've been able to put into the sentence itself. It's very rare for people to go up to one another with a prepared speech ready and to deliver it. If you found that without any sense of repair, you might start to think that that was a very unnatural, ordinary conversation. So it is something that we expect to see. And then the final one I wanted to look at is what we call back-channel communication. Back-channel communication is basically the engagement shown by each participant when it's not their turn to speak. Now, as soon as I tell you about this, you'll suddenly become very, very, very aware of it when you go back into your classroom. It's a little bit like being told that your brain, that your eyes always see your nose and your brain deletes the nose. As soon as you're aware of that information, you become very aware of your nose on your face. You say, oh my God, I can always see it. So back-channel communication, you imagine you've got this person talking, blah, 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 blah. And this person just here is listening, blah, 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 blah. Yeah? This person's doing nothing. They're just looking, staring, watching, waiting for their turn. This person's going to start to get pretty awkward. You're going to be like, blah, 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 blah. And they're going to start wondering, are they listening? Is this person listening to me? So back-channel communication would be blah, 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 blah. It could even just be facial expressions, like this. So next time you're in the classroom and you see your students talking in English, I bet that they're going to be so focused on producing language on this side and understanding the language that's being produced on this side, you're not going to see any back-channel communication. And it is unusual in a normal, ordinary conversation for there to be no back-channel communication. It's actually a skill that needs to be taught to students as they progress with their English. One of the reasons that I think it is worth teaching students, or at least making them aware of back-channel communication, is because when they get as far as C1 advanced or C2 proficiency, if you're looking at the Cambridge exams, when you look at the pronunciation element in the assessment of the speaking paper, the ability to engage in back-channel communication to make the interaction better, it is kind of assessed. So it is something that students need to know how to do if they're going to achieve the highest levels. Plus, it does make it a lot easier for them to manage conversation. Right, so forgive me for talking for so long on the single slide, but now we have a good idea of what the conventions are for ordinary conversation. We can turn our attention after this to one of the other genres, but we can also think about what those conventions mean for our classroom. So I want to share a couple of lesson ideas very quickly with you. So you've got this list of conventions. We know what the conventions are for ordinary conversation. So first idea, teach them to your students. Tell them about them, and then show them a video from YouTube of two people talking, or record yourself and another member of staff talking about plans for the weekend or whatever it is, things that you did the previous weekend. Make that video and show the students and get them to mark which aspects they see. Then, with that video or others like it, get them to focus on things like phatic talk or back-channel communication, and get them to look for specific examples. build up a mini dictionary, if you like, of back channel communication. There are things that people do in back channel communication, and there are things that they don't. So it's natural to hear people listening going, but it's very unusual to hear them go, wowie zowie, zibby zorbob. Okay, so the utterances that you get as part of back channel communication are a small set of possible utterances, but students often need to know what they are, and they might be different going from culture to culture. For example, if you're in Japan, if you listen to back channel communication, which is almost constant throughout ordinary conversation, the term so is used quite often. So you have so. And a Japanese student who takes those conventions into their own ordinary conversation might find that their conversation partner is flummoxed. They go, I don't know what you're saying. Why are you saying this to me all the time? Okay, and then the last idea I had would be to make kind of flashcards of the different conventions that we've just discussed, and then to distribute the cards. Give the students a topic to talk about. Whatever's on the card, the first person can't engage in that kind of convention. So let's say, for example, it's back channel communication. Yeah? So they engage in this ordinary conversation. They're talking with their partner about the topic that's on the board, but they can't respond with any facial expressions. They can't say, yeah, I see. They can't do any of that. They're not allowed. And at the end of the 2 minutes or so that they're talking with their partner, the other person has to guess what was on their card. So this would raise awareness, but it would also be fun. Okay, so the broadcast interview. Let's have a look. What do we really mean when we talk about the broadcast interview? So first of all, I think I should justify why we're going to look at a broadcast interview at all. They are a different genre, and they work differently to ordinary conversations, or to use the abbreviation OCs. And if they work differently, we need to isolate the conventions, and we need to be aware of those conventions. When students look for authentic examples of English, they often go to YouTube. And when they go to YouTube, they often find news reports or interviews between experts and the interviewer, and they'll watch those reports, watch those videos, and they'll get a lot of great English from those videos. However, they won't necessarily be able to take those speech patterns with them into conversation with other people. If they spoke to their friends like an interviewer does in a broadcast interview, their friends might start to think there's something weird going on. And we'll see why, because of some of the conventions in a moment. So knowing that there are different genres is very important, and knowing what those conventions are very important. And that's one of the reasons I've chosen the broadcast interview. And also another good reason to look at broadcast interviews is because the reaction, the interaction between speakers will look a lot like what you get in formal speaking exams. Maybe even more so than in a regular interview. If you think about the way that the interlocutor talks to the candidates, they don't offer any they don't necessarily offer the same things that you would expect to find in an ordinary conversation. So the situation will feel much more like a broadcast interview for the participants than an ordinary conversation. So they need to be aware of that and ready for that when they go into it. So we're going to watch a short video now. It's about 2.5 minutes long, and it's an example of a broadcast interview. It was filmed a couple of years ago, and it involves the guest Boris Becker, famous tennis player, now retired. He's talking to Piers Morgan and Susanna Reid on a kind of morning TV program. So it's kind of current affairs and politics a little bit, but not in a very serious way. They're talking about Brexit, which is a subject close to my heart, sadly. I wish that it wasn't even a subject for us to have to talk about, but I've chosen this one because Boris Becker's kind of an unusual person to ask about Brexit. He's not British. So what can he say? What can he talk about when he's asked questions on the topic of Brexit without being, I don't know, almost offensive, really? I mean, he's a German living in London a lot of the time. And if you've been following the news recently, there's been a lot of anger in Britain, either towards Angela Merkel for her position in terms of Brexit, or against the people who are against Angela Merkel because of Brexit. So, you know, crazy times. I actually think that he handles the interview very well, but you'll get a chance to judge for yourself in a moment. I'm going to show you the next slide just for a moment, and then we're going to switch to the video. Now, what I want you to do as you watch the video, I want you to, if we could just, sorry, if we can, how do we go back? I want to just go back to, sorry, just bear with me a second. Right, if you look at the bottom of the page here, very quickly, there are some different areas that I want you to think about. Choose one of them. And as you're watching the video, refer back to this and see what comes up. For example, back channel communication. Is there much? Do we hear much from either of the interviewers or from Boris Becker? Relevance. This is something that might not necessarily be a part of ordinary conversation, but how relevant are the answers to the questions? So here is the video. Hopefully everyone can hear.
Germany lives in the UK. What do you make of Brexit? What do Germans feel about it? Well, first of all, the reason
Okay.
Reason I've chosen London to be my city in the world. Now, that was a few years.
Brexit. What do Germans feel about Brexit?
Well, first of all, the reason I've chosen London to be my home is because it's my favorite city in the world. Now, that was a few years ago. Things have changed. I still never knew why there was a referendum in the first place. Economically, Britain was doing well, 2 or 3 years ago. So, we all was trying to live together. So, as a foreigner, I don't know if there's, obviously the Brexit is happening sooner or later, what that changes for foreigners. Do I need a visa in the future come in? What effects it has for my children? And so there are a lot of question marks, and it's a nervous time.
Have you felt that attitudes towards other citizens of the EU have changed here? I mean, have you personally experienced anything different?
I remember the morning after the vote 2.5 years ago that I drove into the city. It was eerie, it was quiet, and nobody really know what to do with it. And that really hasn't changed because we were in such a limbo of what that actually happens to foreigners living in the UK.
But you haven't personally experienced any animosity, for instance.
I didn't, no.
So we can carry on just getting on, being together, and hopefully you'll still be able to travel freely.
Well, that's the big question. Obviously, I'm living in London. I don't know the sentiment in the rest of the UK towards foreigners. And I know there's this thing called good foreigners and bad foreigners. I hate that. I hate that label. You're either foreigner, you're not. But just wanted to see what the effects it has on my status.
Do you think? I mean, are there many Germans, from your experience, who actually would like to see a similar thing happen in Germany, that they actually think the European Union is a rather anachronistic organization, they'd rather go out on their own again?
Well, the whole thing started because of an immigration problem 3 years ago, and then obviously Germany took the most of the immigrants, and most of the time it was good, but obviously they have to obey the rule like any citizen in that country. And I think there was a sentiment of a problem with foreigners as such, and I'm very sensitive to that because I'm my mother's Czech. I'm only in a way half German, and I was calling Germany for most of my life home. So coming into the UK and having the referendum, then I thought, why you want to change something that's not broken?
Let me ask you about another story that's been in the news recently.
Problem 2 years ago, and then obviously Germany took the most of immigrants, and most of the time it's good.
Okay, so think about what you've just seen and try to remember those points that I've put at the bottom of the screen before we started watching. Let's go back a little bit and find we want to be here. So the first thing to look at is back channel communication. Was there any? Well, there shouldn't be. In a broadcast interview, there should not be any back channel communication, or if there is, it should be kept down to a minimum. And that's because when you think of an ordinary conversation, the audience is really the same as the participants. The people listening are the people talking to each other. But that's not the same with a broadcast interview. In a broadcast interview, the whole idea is that there is a viewing audience. People in the studio, or people watching TV, or people watching online, and they are the people who the interview is for. Basically, the interviewers are the surrogates or the avatars of the audience, and they are putting questions to the guest on behalf of the audience. Back channel communication would break that system a little bit. It would kind of break the the irreality of it, to put it that way. There are only 2 or 3 examples in the whole video that we just saw, and they were kind of guttural, kind of like that when something particularly germane was said by Boris Becker. So the next thing then would be the interaction patterns. How did it work? Well, in this case, where it was simply that Boris Becker was a guest and he was there to be interviewed about his own feelings, it followed an initiation response pattern. And we saw that for the most part. For example, Piers Morgan asked a question, so he initiated. Boris Becker responded. Finished. The interesting thing was that Suzanne Reid, when she asked her question, so she initiated, there was response from Boris Becker, but then there was this renewed initiation or a feedback loop that was added because she wasn't satisfied with her answer. And this is something that you see a lot more of in what we call the call to account interview, which is a subgenre of broadcast interviews. Now, this is one of the problems with the genre and with genres in general, is that you don't always know which one you find yourself in. Boris Becker was invited into the studio to be interviewed by the 2 people we've seen, and he presumably thought that he was there to relay some of his experiences. In other words, it's an experiential interview. But what happened with Suzanne Reid didn't really follow that plan. So, turn taking, how was it marked? So it generally seemed clear to Boris that the question had been asked and that it was his turn to ask it. We don't know, because I don't know Boris Becker to ask him, and I don't know Piers Morgan, but on a lot of broadcast interviews, the questions are written beforehand and the guest or participant will be aware of the questions before they arrive at the studio or in the period before they go out to be interviewed. So they will know, okay, you've asked the question, it's my turn now. It gets a bit more interesting going the other way. Boris marks the end of his turn by speaking a bit quieter. His voice kind of comes down and he repeats words a little bit. It seems like he's not really planned what he's going to say very much. And as he kind of runs out of ideas, he's like, yeah, so go to the next point. And that was then the time for the interviewer to come back in. They seem to be very quick at picking up on these cues, and that will come from experience and from training. They will know that when a participant in the interview is reacting that way, when they're speaking that way, they'll know, okay, time for me to come in. Okay, so that brings us to the idea of repair. So Boris needs to repair his language while he's talking, and I think that this is natural, and it's to be expected, not just because he's a non-native speaker. His English is fantastic, but it's not his mother tongue, so maybe there is a bit more time that needs to be taken before he can speak. In an interview, you don't get that sort of time, so when he's speaking, he needs to repair because of error correction. But there's also the context here, and that's the idea that this is a very difficult thing to do, to speak at length on questions of such a topical political nature. So he starts talking, then he rethinks, he latches onto this idea of just not knowing what Brexit means for him and for people like him. The interviewers also show evidence of repair strategies, but I think that the reason for it, the rationale, is different. Piers Morgan, in the example I've given here, he says, as a German who lives in the UK, what do you make of Brexit? What do Germans feel about Brexit? So he switched. Now, this is not just repair. It might have been that, but it's also an example of what they call a change of footing. And this is, in this case, going from the purely personal, as a German who lives in the UK, to the national or the general. What do Germans feel about Brexit? This makes it difficult for Boris to respond because he might be about to speak. You could see in the video, he's leaning forward. I'm going to speak now. But then Piers changes the footing of the question and he has to respond appropriately. It's difficult. So what about relevance? And did Boris answer the questions? Well, the short answer is no. He, instead of answering the questions, he answers what he wants to answer about the questions. And for me, it's brilliantly diplomatic. It's really good that instead of answering in the way that he ought to, which is honestly, he answers in the way that he really politically should for the best case scenario. So the question he wants to answer is about not knowing the consequences of Brexit. There are so many other things that he could say, but he chooses not to say those things. And with Piers Morgan, remember the interaction pattern: initiation, response. Piers Morgan, that's enough for him. But not with Suzanne Reid. She wants initiation, response, feedback, reaction. And we see it here. So she's asking about have people's attitudes to foreigners changed since Brexit? And Becca was talking about how strange it is going into London after the day of the referendum. He's avoiding the question, as he should, because it's a very difficult question. And statistically, actually, looking at when I say statistically, I mean looking at the statistics that were published in the weeks and months after the referendum, we can see that there was an increase, a massive increase in the number of hate crimes committed against foreigners in the UK. And it's definitely causative. If the level was here before the referendum and then here straight after the referendum, you can say it was the referendum that unleashed these negative feelings. So Suzanne Reid comes in and she says, but you haven't personally experienced any animosity, for instance. And then he says, I didn't. No. She goes, no. So we can carry on just getting on, being, yeah, together, yeah. Now, notice the difference in the way that Boris is speaking. He's quite loquacious. He's able to talk very readily about the question when he's answering it the way he wants to. But now that Suzanne Reid is calling him to account, he moves from being kind of garrulous or talkative to curt, short answers. I didn't know. She echoes it with no. He says no again. And then she comes back in with, so we can carry on, just getting on, being, yeah, together, yeah. So very short. And this is his way of showing that he disagrees with what's going on. He doesn't like being called to account because that doesn't seem part of the deal. And his reaction is actually a great example of why I made the whole presentation for you. This presentation is to show you what happens when you know the genre conventions and somebody breaks them. This happens. We had the conventions of the broadcast interview for an experiential chit-chat. You know, it's an early morning TV show. It's not very serious. We're not going to push you. And suddenly, Suzanne Reid breaks the rules. She breaks the convention by adding an extra step in the interaction pattern. She calls him to account, and he responds this way. And you'll notice immediately after, he becomes talkative again because he sees, aha, opportunity to get back to my original point, which is, well, we just don't know, do we? And then he's back in his element. But it's so interesting to see what happens when you break the conventions of a genre, even if it's not formally been established. You get this. Very, very interesting. So what does that mean for your lessons? Well, knowing what the conventions are of the broadcast interview means that you can start watching more interviews in your class and trying to identify, like we talked about before, where the conventions are followed and the language used for carrying out those conventions. So get your students watching interviewers, marking the language used for change of footing. The next thing you can do is one of the things that I love doing with writing, which is genre transfer. And this works as well for writing as it will do for speaking conventions. So what you do is you could take, for example, a story that's going a little bit far maybe, and you turn it into a report. Or you take a report and turn it into a story or into an article or into a review, whatever's applicable for your level. Do the same here. Get your students to watch a broadcast interview and change it so that it seems more like ordinary conversation, or vice versa. Get them to record themselves speaking in ordinary conversation, and then get the main points from it and repeat it now as a broadcast interview. Move the furniture around in the classroom. So you've got somebody sitting here, desk in between. It feels like an interview. It will be an interview, and your students will like it. They'll have a lot of fun with it, I should imagine. Then the next thing you can do is to just go further. We've seen 2 of the different genres, but there are many other genres of talk and interaction. A lot of them are transactional. For example, what are the conventions of the genre of somebody going into a shop and asking to buy something? What are the conventions of somebody going into a shop to complain about something they bought, or to ask for a refund, or anything like that? There are so many different genres that they're, it's a massive area worth looking at with your students. But I would recommend starting here, because this is the best place to start with raising awareness of the simple fact that there are genres. If people think that all talk is the same, this is where you can prove that actually it's not quite like that. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for the attention